Good evening. Welcome to the latest episode of On the Hot Seat. I'm your host today, Lee Chin. Today we'll be talking about social protection network and social protection system or network in Malaysia. When we talk about social protection network or system, we're actually referring to policy or measures that could actually provide basic standard of living to the people of a country and also protect them from any major shock like unemployment, serious illness, or perhaps injuries. So this is very crucial or critical actually at this point of time. Quoting my guest tonight, one of my guests tonight, Tricia Yeo, later I'll introduce her onto the show. She said that we are experiencing something like a dual pandemic as well as political instability plight. So especially during this time when we talk about, there will be a lot of people that think that they will need some sort of protection from any major shock, especially unemployment. So how do we strengthen the existing system, especially for these vulnerable groups of people in our society, so they can survive the current economic storm and thrive in the new post-pandemic reality? Joining us tonight will be Professor Jomo Sundaram, a prominent economist and developmental economics scholar, Tricia Yeo, CEO of think tank Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs. Let's welcome both of them. Good evening, Professor. Good evening, Tricia. Welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. Perhaps I would like to start our discussion tonight actually from the point of what is your assessment of the current social protection network in place prior to the pandemic, and how after the pandemic, or how after all these measures that has been taken, that we realize that there is actually a group of very vulnerable people that we should address their needs. Professor, do you care to start first?
Yeah, perhaps I think it might be useful for us to think of this, the development of social protection in Malaysia historically. Mm-hmm. I think it can be traced to the 1950s, when in the context of the anti-communist counterinsurgency, the government, the colonial government realized that it was necessary to try to win the hearts and minds of the people. Just taking military and other actions against the insurgents was not going to be very effective. So you had the beginnings of some kind of social welfare measures introduced in the 1950s, and this has been quite well written up by people like Tim Harper and others. Then the next major development begins in the 1970s, after the tragic events of May 1969, mm-hmm. following the third general election in the country. And during this period, we saw a number of initiatives. I think the most important initiative was the establishment of something called SOCSO, or Perkeso as it is often known in Malay. SOCSO, as the name implies, is Social Security Organization, and it originally had 9 objectives, of which unfortunately only 2 or 3 have actually been introduced. The original vision of Tun Razak and his advisors was actually quite comprehensive. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, SOCSO has been associated primarily with occupational health and occupational accidents and compensation for those who have been injured thereof. I think it is important to think about what was conceived of by the government at that time. And fortunately, many of the subsequent governments, most of the subsequent governments did next to nothing in terms of taking it forward. In fact, the view of subsequent governments, especially from the 1980s, was that privatization was a good thing, that people look after themselves, take on personal responsibility, and so on and so forth. So many of the commitments of the 1970s were abandoned from the 1980s with a turn towards privatization, with heavy reliance on market and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Now, there were a new set of measures which were introduced after the Asian financial crisis, and these were often seen in terms as temporary measures, measures which were often referred to as things by names such as social safety and so on and so forth. I think it's very important for us to think about social protection as institutions which are permanent. They may not necessarily be supporting the population by the same amount all the time. But it's important to think of social protection as permanent institutions, and to think of social safety nets as temporary measures. And what we find now with COVID-19, the so-called prihatin measures, the relief measures, are really social safety net measures. They are really not social protection measures. The existing social protection measures have not really been extended. Now, one of the major developments which we found under and so on and so forth were withdrawn, and instead they were monetized, and schemes such as BRIM were introduced. And so we find that that a number of measures which were previously introduced to deal with questions such as poverty and so on and so forth increasingly were largely withdrawn and substituted by some of these BRIM measures. Now, it's quite some of these measures were necessary, unavoidable, but some of these measures, unfortunately, in my view, had particular biases, which most importantly allowed tremendous room for abuse, in the sense that there was a lot of political discretion involved in the determination of who are the beneficiaries and so on and so forth. And so we have developed a huge superstructure and infrastructure around social provisioning. But a lot of the social provisioning does not reach the intended recipients because of the large superstructure which has been created. And a lot of it has been due to the obsession of people with things like targeting. So you find that targeting has actually resulted in a number of problems. You have the so-called type 1 problems. Type 1 problems are the problems of omission, and the type 2 problems are the problems of unfair inclusion. So you have people who don't deserve to benefit, who do benefit, and so forth. But I think when you really think about the kinds of costs, there really is very little reason to be so concerned about the such measures. There are bound to be leakages if you are trying to have measures, but if you have such a huge infrastructure to check and so on and so forth, and you're grudging people $50 ringgit in benefits and so on and so forth, so it really is quite ridiculous. Some of the so-called safeguards which have been introduced at the insistence of many of the advisors of governments, not only in Malaysia but also elsewhere. So the social protection measures which we have in the recent period, in the last half year or so, have been largely those associated with prihatin. But I would basically put it to you that the disruption caused by COVID-19, and more importantly, the government measures in response to COVID-19, because we have to remember that many countries in East Asia did not have stay-in-shelter lockdowns. They were able to take a lot of early action, preventive measures, so that there was no need for a lockdown. Even in the case of China, it was only Wuhan and the 3 provinces around Wuhan where there was stay-in-shelter lockdowns imposed. For the rest of the country, there were a lot of preventive measures introduced, but no stay-in-shelter. In the case of Vietnam, where there has not been a single death, perhaps until recently, we find that although the first infection was as early as January, we find that that they have never had to resort to a nationwide stay-in-shelter lockdown. So we can see Laos likewise, and Kerala in South India. And many of these governments have also been quite successful in making sure that the measures they have introduced have reached the needy. Now, I think quite a number of people have benefited from the measures which were introduced in Malaysia, but unfortunately, many of these measures were too and have not lasted very long. Although economic activities have resumed and so on and so forth, many activities are not returning to the previous levels, and so incomes are generally lower. As a result of incomes being lower, you generally have less consumption, less spending, and so the economy is chugging along at a low-level equilibrium, if you want to put it that way. And so this situation can be deadly if we don't do something about it. If we don't try to resume a higher level of economic activity, we are likely going to transform the COVID-19 recession into a depression. So it is extremely important that early action measures, and much of these measures will have to involve relief. It's no point using this to start talking about generating new growth and so on and so forth if you do not even have the means by which people in the country will be able to resume spending, resume consumption, resume investments, and so on and so forth. So relief becomes extremely important, and that's why I say that we need a combination of social protection for so-called normal times, and you need special measures for these extraordinary times.
Okay. I think, Professor, you touched on a few things about, I think it's also, I've read some of your articles mentioning about the stimulus package, but it's actually pointless because there's no output in terms of the economy and how aggregated demand it's gonna how it's gonna affect aggregated demand in the end. So this is a situation where you see it's gonna put us into depression instead, not only recession. Is that the case?
Yes, basically, I think a recession was unavoidable. You have COVID-19, and because of the failure to take early enough actions, it became necessary to have a stay-in-shelter lockdown. We can quarrel about the details of how these measures were implemented, but I think nobody will deny the need for stay-in-shelter lockdowns, at least in certain parts of the country.
Yes.
The need for very strict measures to ensure that you do not have a resurgence of the epidemic, to contain the contagion, so to speak. But having said that, what we have, that recession is inevitable, but we now have a situation where Malaysia has, for various historical reasons, inherited a very open economy. And you have a situation now where external demand is okay. Plastic gloves are selling very well. Sex gloves are selling very well, and so on and so forth. Some PPE, but we hardly don't produce the PPE. And but many of the things which are needed during this time, for which demand has increased, we do not produce ourselves. The production which we have, which is externally oriented, which has been encouraged very much since colonial times and in post-colonial times as well, that external orientation has been vastly disrupted. You have countries like the United States and Japan telling their corporations to get out of China, come back to the US or to Japan. And the result of it is not just that the Chinese subsidiaries of these corporations get disrupted. The result also is that the entire supply chain, including supply chains involving Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, get disrupted. So we have external demand being adversely affected, and then internal demand in the country is also externally affected because you do not have the spending power. You really need very extraordinary measures, not only relief measures, you need extraordinary measures. For example, you have people who have signed long-term leases, okay, and they need to continue to make the lease payments unless you introduce a special measure to exempt them from that. So this requires very special legislation, very bold legislation, very forward-thinking legislation. There are some economists, for example, who have been arguing for that the government should be the payer of last resort. Help many of these small businesses, family enterprises, and so on and so forth, to be able to meet some of these commitments so that they can survive this very, very difficult period, which unfortunately is likely to be extended. So if we do not create the conditions for reviving the economy, this thing can be quite protracted. Of course, we should also use this opportunity to think about new types of production, which we should be emphasizing for the medium term. But those things are not going to happen overnight.
Yes.
And we need to think about the short term as in connection with the medium term, rather than simply think in terms of the medium and long term.
Okay, Professor, I'll get back to you on the condition that we need to create to revive the economy. But Tricia, maybe you can weigh in a little bit on your thoughts about the vulnerable group and what do you think about the social protection system or network net in Malaysia?
Thanks for inviting me. I like the points that have been made so far. I just want to respond to a couple of points that Prof. Jomo talked about. So firstly, I think it's a nice kind of entry point to think about the historical aspect of how and where Malaysia came to. So yes, in the 1970s, after what happened in 1969, in 1971, the Razak government came up with this whole plan of developing the entire country, and with that was associated like the Second Malaysia Plan, the NEP, which then continued into the National Development Plan, National Vision Plan, and so on. And so since then, we've sort of had replications of the 1971 approach. And I agree that in one sense, the crises of the 1998, the Asian financial crisis, the financial crisis of 2009 and 2010, and I think this year perhaps that there is a reckoning of some sort, but these three crises together have not fundamentally yet changed the development narrative or the development story of Malaysia. I just want to bring a couple of perspectives in. So while Prof. Jomo talked about SOCSO as one of the things that was done institutionally, I would also dare to venture that the government introduced a whole slew and a whole slate of government-linked companies, so GLCs, or rather state-owned enterprises, to be able to provide that sort of social protection. And this was, all the multiple setups that were instituted, of course, Petronas was because of oil, Mara provided education, Felda. All these institutions actually did serve, or the objective was to serve a certain social purpose. And many of them actually have, they've contributed a lot in terms of scholarships over the years. We also should recognize that many of these were set up to uplift the Bumiputra communities and have done, very successfully as well. They did create a whole generation of successful professional entrepreneurs, doctors, professionals, lawyers, and so on, who are Bumiputra. So I think we should recognize that that those institutions have provided, aspects of social protection. And I think I want to justify that by actually looking at something that's more current, which is the new PLI, right? The government actually revised the PLI recently. And if you look at the multidimensional poverty index, the MPI, it actually breaks it down into 4 areas, right? So you've got education, health, standard of living, and income. And maybe I can talk just a little bit on each of those points.
Sure.
How social protection, should be provided, or how it's actually defined based on these indicators. So like I said, many of these GLCs actually did provide some level of education assistance or provision of scholarships that allow people to get into tertiary education institutions in a significant way. In terms of health, I also think that actually Malaysia has done well. In fact, one of the reasons that I think Malaysia did so well in terms of flattening the curve in the region during the COVID-19 crisis is precisely because we have, over the many years, invested pretty well into our public health system. Our expenditure, though, is still relatively low. So the public expenditure, the Ministry of Health expenditure as a percentage of the GDP is actually less than 2%, which is very low compared to the WHO recommended amount, which is at least 4% or above, even 6%. But if you look at the total expenditure of healthcare, including private sector healthcare, and I guess we can argue, okay, like should we include private sector healthcare or not? It's actually 4.24% as of 2017, and that's quite significant. And if we start talking about the difference between like private healthcare and public healthcare, I mean, I think we also need to understand that a lot of our GLCs are actually investing into private healthcare.
Yes.
So are they actually, private or are they public in that sense? So I want to talk about, I think Prof talked about cash handouts as targeted subsidies, and basically, so this point about being able to provide like a permanent social protection solution coupled by like temporary social safety nets, and how government has now started to do a lot of these cash handouts. BRIM was actually started after the Selangor and the Penang state governments had been taken over by the opposition. And one perspective, I don't know how true this is, one perspective that has been argued by some politicians is that BRIM was actually a response by Barisan Nasional to the kinds of cash assistance and provisions being given at the state level of Selangor and Penang. And so if I backtrack a bit, and I do have a point to all this, which actually does come to the issue of federal-state relations, which is something that I write quite a lot on, is that the states provided all this cash assistance because they do not control policy domains. So most of the main policy domain areas are actually dominated by the federal government. So that leaves the state governments with very little. State governments don't control healthcare, they don't control education. So the only way that they could make themselves, seem significant in the eyes of the voters was to be able to provide these aids and these welfare assistance in the form of cash, or spend the money in ways that had nothing to do with policy determination.
Yes.
So then, arguably, it became a sort of not a policy competition, which would have been better, because then different levels can show, okay, I'm doing this policy in a better way than someone else. But what it became, instead of a policy competition, in a way was a competition for which side is able to, not necessarily votes, but which side is able to provide more social assistance through cash.
Yes.
And I think that's probably not a very sustainable way to go. And we can talk a lot more about that, but one of the solutions I would like to put forth is that, a social welfare assistance and services, whether in the form of in cash or in kind, to the communities in need, needs to be a lot more institutionalized than it is today. Today, people depend on politicians to be able to provide them assistance when you have someone in the member of the family who passes away. Even throughout the COVID-19 crisis, I think many people actually sought assistance from their local adun and local MP or local councillor, when by right it should have been institutionalized. In the whether it's SOCSO or through registration within the e-Kasih system, where the Jabatan Kebajikan Masyarakat would have access. So I think that there are a couple of different things here, but the institutions, I don't think, are playing as much of a role or as big of a role in being able to meet the needs of their constituents. And because of that, the politicians have to come in to play that role, to play that sort of intervening role. And that actually brings us to the bigger question about the vicious cycle of political funding and the potential corruption of political funding, the act of funding political parties and politicians.
Yeah.
I've said quite a long story there.
No worries. I think you have touched on similar points about the handouts, where you talk about where Prof. Jomo also pointed out that there will be like issues in terms of distributions. It could be abuse and who to be distributed, and it should be institutionalized. I think for the sake of our audience, maybe when we talk about institutionalized, it should be something that anyone who is in need could go and apply, instead of you have to have someone to recommend you. You have to go to your adun. So it should be a situation like that. And that would be much more effective in eradicating poverty in terms of policy-wise. Is that? I think that's what you're trying to point out, right, Tricia? That's the bit about it.
There needs to be a lot more of a systematic way to evaluate, because I think right now, from what I've heard, people who are registered, say in the e-Kaseh system, once you're registered, you actually sometimes can receive multiple welfare benefits from multiple ministries within the federal government, and then you also get assistance from the from the state governments. You also get assistance from Lembaga Zakat. So I don't think that the coordination is done very well. So I think what we have now is really just it's probably very much less institutionalized permanent assistance. It's very much about not even social safety nets. It's plugging the gap with a plaster in multiple places, and then that whole cycle repeats itself and it continues. And I agree that the current economic conditions, and I think even before the COVID-19, Malaysia was already, our economic statistics were already not doing very well.
Yes.
I think COVID-19 basically accelerated the whole process even further. And I do think it is an opportunity for us to address some of the structural problems that our economy has faced, which had not really been looked into over the last few decades. But while it's important to provide those temporary social safety nets, I think what's really needed is to think about what would be a more long-term solution. So yes, being able to continue to provide some protection to those who are really in need, but also you can't live on handouts forever, basically, right? So at the end of the day, there needs to be the provision of jobs. There needs to be the provision of maybe even small capital for those who want to be able to start their own businesses or to resume their businesses, to resume their restaurant business. For instance, a lot of F&B restaurants have had to shut down over the COVID-19 period. So how do you restart that economy? I think looking at the fundamentals of the structure of the economy, that needs to happen while being able to provide for those who are ready to fall through the cracks and not making it through this crisis.
Okay. All right. Prof, I think maybe this is a good point where we can start talking about how we can revive, what are the conditions to revive our economy, and you talk about recovery. How can we recover in a much more meaningful way, addressing all these long-term issues that both you and Tricia have pointed out just now?
Well, I think the biggest challenge right now is how to we cannot really count on external demand as we have in the past. As Tricia correctly noted, the external economic situation has deteriorated since 2008, and although there seem to be some signs of improvement after 2014, the prices of our primary commodities, palm oil, etc., went down. So it wasn't great to begin with. Okay. In addition to that, there have been a number of problems. Industrialization in this country has basically ended after the Asian financial crisis. Been very little new industries developing, and the commitment to new technologies and so on has basically been very, very weak. the ability to encourage Malaysians to develop new technology has been very poor. There's actually been active discrimination against limited Malaysian capacities. For example, MIMOS was created by the Malaysian government, and there was an actual order not to give contracts to MIMOS, for areas where it had competence. Of course, we don't want everything to go to MIMOS just because it exists, but this was a really bizarre kind of attitude of the last Barisan National Government. Now, why all this happened, it's too complicated to get into right now. But I think what we really need to think about is to what the domestic demand also is not there. People just are not spending. Even who have money, saving it for a rainy day. They are very, very worried about whether a second wave is going to happen, a third wave is going to happen, and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of concerns, and it's not easy to address those kinds of concerns. No matter what you say, people are going to look. For example, south of the Causeway, they saw there was a second wave in Singapore. This second, a second wave in other parts of the world, and so on. So people are going to be very cautious for quite some time to come. Having said that, there should be a facilitation of to enable people to spend much more than they are spending right now, but we have a very serious problem in that even something as basic as food, for example, we import a great deal of our food requirements. Now, I'm not saying that we produce everything we consume. I don't think it is viable, for example, for Malaysia to get seriously into producing a lot of which is needed. Neither should we be producing a lot of beef and so on and so forth. But a lot of other stuff is actually is being imported, and a lot of the food which is being produced in the country is not produced under safe conditions. Excessive amount of chemicals, excessive amount of for example, antibiotics are being used in animal breeding and so on and so forth. So there is a role for government regulation, but the attitude in recent years, if not decades, has been, the less government regulation, the better for business. And actually, it made things worse because, the only time Malaysians became worried about, concerned about food is that when our food, the trucks carrying our food was stopped at the Causeway and so on and so forth. So, that's we should have a commitment to feeding Malaysians safely. So we really need to think for example, there is understandably renewed concern about food security. In the past, since the colonial period, food security has been equated with just producing more rice. And we are well beyond that. And if we say leave it entirely to the market, every farmer will be encouraged to produce Musang King or something like that. And we can't live on durian alone, okay? So we have to get real.
Why?
Huh? Sorry? You'd love to.
We could try. Just a joke.
Okay, yeah.
We might have to worry about diabetes after that.
Yeah, I think we have to be concerned about Trisha misfeeding a young child, But more seriously, I think we really have to think about producing food for Malaysians under safe conditions, and we need to begin to think about nutrition, not just about producing enough food, but making sure we have a lot of problems in Malaysia which are due to malnutrition, not because there's not enough food, but people are often eating excessive amount, consuming excessive amount of sugar, consuming excessive amount of salt, consuming excessive amount of unhealthy oils and fats. Everything is deep fried because when you deep fry food, the lack of freshness in the food can be more easily concealed, and so on and so forth. So we need to begin to have regulations which ensure that Malaysians are living safely, living well, living healthily. So there has to be a greater priority, not simply on on increasing the aggregate numbers of how much is being produced, how much is being consumed, and so on and so forth, but also quality. Quality matter, and and we have had some progress in terms of raising living standards. People are living longer, and so on and so forth. But all too many people Malaysian unnecessary numbers of people have problems like diabetes and a whole range of other problems of what are called food-related or diet-related non-communicable diseases. In addition, we have a whole range of problems because people do not have enough micronutrients. Okay, they do not have enough iron. A lot of girls, including girls who are pregnant, are anemic, and women who are pregnant are anemic, and we have a lot of other deficiencies in terms of calcium consumption and so on and so forth. Now, fortunately, science that tells us that many of the old staples are perhaps less required. We don't need to get milk all the time. We can get things from soya and so on and so forth. But we must ensure that, and I'm not suggesting that we go into soya production in a big way, but we must ensure that the sources of our soybean imports are safe. So you can get enough protein, you can get enough micronutrients from other sources which are much, much more accessible and healthy sources. People are now making rendang, for example, with mushrooms. Very, very, in my view, maybe Tricia might disagree with me, I find it very, very tasty, some of these things. So we need to begin to experiment, and young people are very keen on experimenting in these ways. But we need to experiment in ways which will promote healthy diets. That's just one example in the area of food, which is so essential to life. But there are other areas as well. Many of the things which we are producing, for example, look at our big commitment to this silly trade agreement called the CPTPP. Okay, the single largest item which is going to be imported if we ratify the CPTPP is more imported cars. Who would be the main beneficiary? Probably Japan. More Japanese cars would be imported. Second important item, plastic, including plastic waste. Who are the major exporters of plastic waste to Malaysia? Japan, Australia, Singapore. Is that what we want to be? China has banned the import of plastic waste, and we are going to a level of trying to pretend as if we are plastic waste. In fact, more than 80% of the plastic waste which is imported is not processed. Yeah, only a small amount is processed, and many of the companies which import plastic waste actually just put it into landfills, which is not very desirable from the point of view of the ecology and so on and so forth. So we need to begin to think about the quality of life in a whole variety of ways. We need to think, for example, about promoting new industries. Two areas, for example, where we have a huge potential is, one is in the area of palm oil related biodiesel. Recently, Indonesia announced that they have now developed 100% palm oil biodiesel. Malaysia, we are still quarreling at a level of whether to go from 5 to 10% and things like that. And we are using these in Europe. In 2006, they chose to go with biodiesel. Okay, with other much more expensive vegetable oils. In the US, they have gone to bioethanol. So we are well placed to promote the use of biodiesels, and we should lead by example. There should be the encouragement of the use of diesel engines and use and the development, competitive development. Now, it is true that we already had developed biodiesel more than 3 decades ago in the 1980s. But what have we done about it? We have not moved it to market. We have not made it commercialized and gone international with it. Another area, of course, is we are the single largest source of photovoltaic solar panels for the US. Okay, we are now the single largest source. But we have a single Malaysian company involved in this? Unfortunately, no. Okay, and if production costs go up by hiring more Malaysians, for example, these companies can just as easily move to some other place. So we need to have Malaysian companies which are capable. It's not as if the technology is so difficult. You know, you look at the components for the cars, Proton or Peradua and so on. There are 4,000 automotive components required. For photovoltaic solar panels, there are less than 200 involved. You know, so these are things which are achievable, but there need to be incentives to encourage Malaysian firms to go into these areas. It's not going to happen spontaneously. It's not going to happen simply because you let market forces take over. You need to have active industrial policy.
Prof?
Yeah.
Actually, if I can follow up on your point, I mean, if you believe that government should actively play a role in deciding which industries to go into, how would government be able to identify the right industries? I mean, what if the government makes a mistake and actually, you know, the market's actually proceeding in some other way, in a more enterprising way, in a way that perhaps government was not aware of because there are certain innovations that it didn't keep track of? Yeah.
Well, you know, governments make mistakes. The private sector makes mistakes all the time.
Sure.
The private sector has a very high price to pay. Governments also make mistakes. I think everybody knows, for example, that over a decade ago, Singtech lost 800 million, okay, on a particular venture. And, it was seen as an unavoidable loss, and the government went on, moved on. Okay. Now, with Malaysia, in the case of Malaysia, we do not have enough checks and balances within government, and the appointment of politicians to lead a lot of GLCs, government-linked companies, is a disastrous movement. It worsens a situation which was already bad to begin with, rather than try to address the problem. And this is a disaster. So what is the kind of a combination of allowing the market to determine what is competitive and so on. And this has been done time and time again. It's been done in Japan, it's been done in Korea, it's been done in Taiwan, it's been done in China, it's been done in Singapore and so on. One measure, for example, is what is called economic effective protection conditional on export promotion, because you want these companies to be able to export and to compete externally, but you give them certain temporary support in order for them to be able to do so. Now, this can be done. If you think, for example, about how Malaysians, plantation companies, when during the colonial period and even after independence, okay, plantation companies were owned in London. Very few major plantation companies were owned here. It was only during the 1970s that these companies were taken over by Malaysian government. Through the market, they were bought over, okay? In other countries, they nationalized them. But in the case of Malaysia, we bought over at very high cost, but, so they were brought back to Malaysia. And what the Malaysian government realized at that time is that these plantation companies were making huge profits, and they were giving dividends because they didn't invest in anything else. Okay, so what the Malaysian government did was to start investing, because the transition had been made from the 1960s from rubber, where prices were really low, to after World War II, the invention of synthetic rubber and so on and so forth. So in the 1960s, 1970s, we had more and more palm oil. But the Europeans were discriminating against the import of palm oil. By the more refined the palm oil was, the higher the tariffs. It's a phenomenon which economists call tariff escalation. So Malaysia introduced a reverse mechanism. If you export crude palm oil, you pay a higher export duty. If you export refined palm oil, you pay a lower duty. And Malaysian palm oil would have broken into that market. But the Europeans increased escalation. They might talk about free market and all that, but they don't practice it, okay? So they didn't allow the palm oil from Malaysia to go into Europe. So what did Malaysia do then? Malaysia then did what in those days, there wasn't, in many countries didn't have very much foreign exchange, including countries like India, the Soviet Union, Pakistan, China, and so on and so forth. So Malaysia basically had what were called barter trade agreements with all these 4 countries. Of course, that was then, and the situation today is very different. All of these countries are no longer interested in barter trade agreements, with the possible exception of Russia and perhaps Pakistan. But India doesn't need it, China doesn't need it. Okay, the barter trade agreement. So the bargaining position is very, very different. But you can, nonetheless, if not for that measure which was introduced, those measures which were introduced, Malaysia would not have refined. And the Malaysian engineers, okay, my generation and people older than me, they were actually well-trained engineers, but they were completely underutilized, asked to do maintenance work and little more. But they rose to the challenge. And if you look right now, I think you know this, Tricia, because you work for the Selangor state government. In Selangor, there are over 1,000 engineering firms, mainly medium and small size, in the Port Klang area. Many of them have survived without any government support. They are internationally competitive, but they cannot make that extra jump. They cannot become what companies in Korea and Taiwan have become, precisely because they do not enjoy the kind of government support which those companies enjoy in other places.
Yeah. So on that point, actually, just have a couple of interventions. So one, I think the research has shown that it's not so much about like which specific industries and sectors that government should be supporting, but it's more about whether these companies can be supported as they climb up the value chain, right? So no matter which sector and no matter which industry you're in, if that company or a set of companies can show and prove to government that they're able to climb up by producing things in a more high value way. So you mentioned rubber gloves just now. I mean, yeah, rubber gloves is pretty basic production. But say in the area of machineries, if they are able to produce like high-end value machineries in whatever, that serves whatever market, I think then that could be an area which government could provide some incentives. But again, I think, yeah, we probably want to caution against government selecting like which sector and industry it is that needs to develop. So we can look at the statistics, we can look at the data, where Malaysia is like competitive compared to our regional neighbors. It's basically looking at like the kind of input-output table. What do we contribute more value compared to our regional neighbors? And then that's where we can compete on, and not just compete in the sector itself, but compete in terms of going like more high value than producing something that's very basic. The other point was you brought up on CPTPP. I know that we won't make this about the CPTPP, but wouldn't you think that the CPTPP actually allows then the Malaysian producers and manufacturers and local enterprises to be able to access even bigger markets beyond Malaysia? Because Malaysia is actually a very small market. I mean, you talked about how our local demand will never be anywhere as well. Say Indonesia, for instance, right? Indonesia is a huge market on its own. Malaysia is a small market, so the domestic producers actually would, I would imagine, and our research actually shows that it increases the percentage of our GDP, or it contributes a greater value to our own production if we were to sign on to the CPTPP. But and I know there are other aspects of it which can be problematic, but just on the point of being able to access like a bigger market, would that be an area that perhaps you would agree with? And finally, just going back and circling back to the point about food security that you mentioned, I mean, I do agree that actually the COVID-19 period has like caused us pause to think about where we get our food from, how we produce it, like whether we could actually get it locally, precisely because like the supply chains were just broken all over the place, right? So on the one hand, yes, it's important to think about food security from a domestic point of view. And we've done some research also in terms of like agricultural subsidies, where we've shown that the government in providing agricultural subsidies can actually produce more harm than good. Because when you subsidize in, say, like the rice market, for instance, so Bernas is a good example, which monopolizes the rice market, it actually blocks off potential innovation from happening among the smaller producers or the smaller farmers. So to help the small farmers, actually, if you remove the monopoly, you remove the subsidies, it actually helps more innovation to take place. But having said that, while we think about food security like domestically, I think it's also like kind of just reminded everyone again about how the global value chain has been impeded significantly because of COVID and because of the fact that, regionally we get our food, say, from Vietnam, and even within the region, the value chain is broken. I think, it causes us to think about whether the region can become stronger together, even if the borders are still closed off like in other parts of the world, but whether within the region itself, could there be some kind of safety measures and security, public health wise, that within the region we could agree on. So those are just some points, and if you would like to respond to, or actually we've been ignoring our co-moderator, sorry.
No, don't worry. I think you have raised very good points. But Prof, do you want to respond to Tricia?
I will be very happy to respond to Tricia, but I'm in your hands. You are. Tricia is defending her organization's position on a number of things, which I thought she would be wise to avoid doing so, since she was pregnant and raising her baby and doing her PhD during the relevant time. But I mean, firstly, we have had more than 60 years of this. We have to trust the market. The market is fair, and we will always be exporters, and we cannot do anything but export, and we cannot we have to get into these global supply chains and so on and so forth. These are all myths which have been refuted time and again. It's not as if the research is conclusive in the way which ideas has been claiming, but selectively, there's always an element of truth in everything she says. But it's how you take that element of truth and extend it into a generalizable proposition. True, governments are being abused all the time. I would be the first to acknowledge that. And we publish so much material, talking about government abuses and so on and so forth. But it is precisely that checking of that government abuse which needs to be stopped, rather than the abandonment which country has developed without government being proactive. The United States, that's a myth. If the North had not won the U.S. Civil War against the South, the United States would be like Australia, an agricultural producer, and it would never be able to be an industrial power. So we need to begin to think about transformation, and structural transformation is always the result of a relationship. And this is why the struggle against the abuse of government, the struggle against corruption is very, very important. And this is why I appreciate the work of ideas and others who are struggling against this. But having said that, it doesn't mean you believe in all this stuff about markets being very good, free trade agreements being good. In fact, there are abuses which even now, even the Trump government recognizes. It doesn't want to have ISDS, for example. It doesn't want to have free trade agreements because the Americans suddenly woke up. When TransCanada, it's a company which was supposed to build the oil pipeline, they sued the American government after President Obama canceled the pipeline, and they would have won the case. And that would have been unprecedented, the US losing an ISDS case. And that's why Trump government, Lighthizer in particular, the US trade representative, has changed his position and says, no way. But it is still in the CPTPP. That's just one example. The strengthening of intellectual property rights, the evidence is conclusive that intellectual property rights have hindered rather than advanced technological innovation. And yet there are people who still claim that, IPRs are so essential. If not for IPRs, there would be no progress, and so on and so forth. You look at the whole history of what has been happening, the big difference between what is happening now and what happened with earlier vaccine developments. Think about tuberculosis. The BCG was invented over a century ago. Think about Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk said that owning the polio vaccine is like trying to say that somebody owns the sun. It's ridiculous, But yet, now, under intellectual property rights claims, all this is now made possible. This is a complete fabrication by lawyers, contemporary modern law. And it is generally acknowledged by any serious legal scholars, not by the partisans of intellectual property rights, of course. So there is no evidence that intellectual, that this has been necessary. And one of the major contributions of President Mandela was to fight for the public health exception to the intellectual the TRIPS arrangement in the World Trade Organization. And it is because of that. But look at what has happened. You take, for example, what is called national licensing. The only country, maybe Li Ching, I don't know, I'm not sure how old you are, but I think Tricia will remember something called avian flu.
Yes.
And avian flu, not a single government was able to manufacture, using national licensing, to manufacture a flu protection. The only government which did so was the US government under George W. Bush. And the irony, of course, is that the only continent where there was no avian flu was the Americas, because birds don't fly that far, from either Asia or from Europe all the way to America. So the birds didn't fly, they didn't bring avian flu to America. So the only continent which actually had 300 doses of 300 million doses of Tamiflu available to protect the American population was the United States. The only country. Taiwan tried, other countries tried to produce Tamiflu using national licensing. They all could not succeed. So let us face it. Actually, what are called free trade agreements have very little to do with trade. Most of it has to do with property rights and claims of profits, of rents, to use the correct economic term against this. So I think we should not really waste the time of Malaysians and others with trying to defend the CPTPP and all its nonsense. Nobody seriously believes that medium-sized enterprises are going to benefit because of the chapter on SMEs in the CPTPP. And all the evidence, even by the boosters, the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C., even by the boosters, claim that the trade benefits, trade as opposed to other benefits, the trade benefits are actually about 15% of the claim benefits. And the claim benefits are very small. Okay? So the whole point of the TPP originally, and Obama was very clear about this, and Hillary Clinton was very clear about it. The whole point of the TPP was basically the encirclement of China. Now, why should we, if we are serious about ZOPFUN, about this region becoming a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, why should we choose sides in that fight between the US and China? I'm not interested in that. And so we need an independent policy. And that's why I'm very, very worried that in the next 2 months, before the American election, you need the slightest excuse to start a war in the South China Sea. And it's not going to happen against India because India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers. It's not going to happen in Iran because it's going to be so blatant. But South China Sea, you think, you look at what happened. How did Mrs. Thatcher get elected in 1983? The only way she could get re-elected was by starting the war in the Falklands. How did George W. Bush get re-elected in 2004? By starting the war in Iraq. I mean, war has been used politically for political advantage. We should stay out of it. We should not get involved in these kinds of wars. I'm not.
I'm so sorry. I have to stop both of you on this.
Just one last thing, and I think maybe we should conclude, to go back to the original question. But just a final thing on this. I think we should probably have maybe I could meet you, Prof, to talk about this whole analysis of the economic value and so on. And I agree that if a free trade agreement is not so much about trade, then we should not call it a free trade agreement as such. And I know we can have a really long conversation about the trade agreement stuff. But I just wanted to clarify that. I do think that there is a huge role for government to play. I mean, I'm probably not of the opinion of my predecessors in the organization that would say that unfettered markets are the way to go. I completely believe that regulating the markets is important. I believe that taxation is important. I believe that the provision of healthcare and education by the government is important, and that kind of brings us back to where we were at the very beginning when we're talking about social protection.
Yes.
Which is that, and I'm not sure how long we have now, but I just want to highlight some of the fundamental things once again, which is that number one, if there are significant proportions of our society and communities that we can visibly see falling through the cracks, especially as a result of what's happened this year, then we should collectively be responsible to help them, whether it's through government, working with NGOs, with communities. So I think private individuals should also play an active role in helping people who fall through the cracks and the vulnerable communities like that. I completely agree with. I think there should be a relook into how GLCs are used for this purpose. So that means relooking the entire governance structure of GLCs. I agree that politicians without the right competency levels should not hit GLCs. Maybe one or two in the board, that could be okay, because it's arguable that maybe you want to provide a sort of nationalistic role for the GLC to provide for the people of Malaysia. But there needs to be some basic competencies to run GLCs, that especially whose objectives are to serve a social need and a social good. And like I said in the very beginning, GLCs have played a role in providing education assistance and scholarships and so on. So we need to evaluate, have they done so well in the last 10 to 20 years? And if not, why not? If they are, then which ones are successful, and those that are not successful, can they actually, no longer exist, for instance? And I think nobody knows how many GLCs there are in the country at the federal and the state levels. So that's the second point. And the third point, the institutionalization, I think, of assistance really needs to come about. I think that it's very ad hoc at the moment. Like I said, it's like a plaster, right? You kind of cut the gap here and there. And because of that, a lot of it, the dependency goes back to the politicians. And that's not sustainable, and it's not healthy, because it creates for a very, it's basically potential corruption can take place when you depend too much on the politicians. And also, I guess we should also think about the civil service themselves. Is the civil service efficient enough to be able to provide that institutional aid. So I'm not sure whether I don't know what the answer is to that, because we haven't done enough research on the civil service itself. So yeah, I just wanted to draw it back to the original questions. But yes, Prof, bearing in mind that government has a role for sure, and I think I'm with you where like we don't like, I think neither of us like state capture, right? Like we don't like companies and we don't like big corporations capturing government, and that kind of the role that both corrupt politicians and corrupt corporations play in order to basically state capture of corporations. I mean, I think neither of us likes that, so I'll just leave it there.
I think I also want to draw back the discussion to very practical issues. When we talk about social protection, whether it's when you're talking about like mandatory, contributory, non-contributory, any form of social protection, we will talk about the costs with such limited fiscal space. How do you do this trade-off? Tricia, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, the country has been quite dependent on oil and gas resources. Previously, even more. Like we used to depend on Petronas for more than a third of our annual government budget, basically the expenditure. That has gone down to about 19% because of the price of oil has basically fallen, right, per barrel. That's still quite high though. Like it's not almost 20%, right? And as you see, every year Petronas is also dependent on to provide like dividends. But I think that's not sustainable. I mean, the classic answer is actually to make sure that the government invests in multiple places, so it's not just dependent purely on oil itself. Yeah, so I think we need to think about like, is our tax system, like, is that efficient enough?
Yes.
Currently, I know the personal income taxes, not very much is being captured. So we need to look at like people who are in the secondary market, people who are in informal sectors, those who are basically, I mean, there's a growth of the gig economy now. Can we make sense of what's happening in the informal sector? So I think not enough is understood about that. That's one of the ways to look at it at the moment.
Prof, do you want to weigh in on this one with the limited fiscal space? What are the interventions or whatever that you think that we could, or the government has to really tackle at this point of time? I think it's much more pressing. You have mentioned a lot about some of the suggestion that you mentioned earlier. Actually, it's kind of long term. So can we just draw back a little bit to something short term that perhaps this government should look at, or maybe something that we should it should be taken care of in the upcoming budget?
I think we are in a very difficult situation now.
Yes.
The reason why we have limited fiscal space is due to various actions undertaken by pre-existing governments. My late colleague Professor Ismail Saleh, pointed out long ago that income distribution after tax is more unequal than before tax. Okay, he showed this for the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1980s, a series of tax reforms began from around the mid-1980s. And were even worse. They were more regressive, to use the economic term. Income tax rates were brought down, and more importantly, the idea of consumption taxes were introduced. And these consumption taxes were more recently rationalized in the form of the GST, a value-added taxation, which in principle is not a bad rationalization, but the weight of so-called consumption taxes versus income taxes has really shifted away from income taxes and there's almost no wealth tax in this country. Okay, unlike many developed countries where there are much higher levels of wealth tax. And even in Islam, there are provisions for wealth taxation, but we don't seem to have any of that here in this country. So we have a situation where the wealth tax, the situation after taxation is worse and has become progressively worse over time. Okay. Now on the expenditure side, government spending, we all think that the government is spending for the poor and so on and so forth. In fact, if we do a serious analysis of government expenditure, and this was done a long time ago by Jacob Meerman, and I'm sure, I hope Ideas does such a study for the contemporary period. We find that on the expenditure side as well, the outcomes of expenditure by the government were more unequal than before expenditure by government. So both on the tax side as well as on the spending side, the interventions of governments were actually unequal rather than equalizing.
Oh.
Most of us think the converse is true. Most of us believe the converse is true because of the rhetoric of governments. This is not peculiar to Malaysia, to be fair.
Okay.
It's of many other countries as well. But this is something certainly we should be looking at very carefully.
Unequal expenditure, unequal in what sense, Prof?
On the expenditure side,
Yeah.
there's a methodology which Jacob Meerman used. I think he was working for the World Bank when he did the study. It's called Public Expenditure in Malaysia. Jacob Meerman, MEERMAN. But there has not been any comparable study on since then. As far as the tax side is concerned, after Ismail Saleh, Professor Wee Chong Hui from Sarawak did a study, but there's been nothing very comparable since then, and it is very important for us to look at this, So the impact. Sorry, I don't know what. So what we have is a situation where the role, what is called the fiscal impact, is actually disequalizing rather than equalizing, contrary to what most of us presume. And this is something which we need to study. And this has been shown for other countries, such as the United States and so on. Even Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, said that he pays much less tax than his secretary. And this is what is happening we often think of the United States as exceptional, but in fact, the United States has become almost the norm in many countries. So the impact of the tax system, the impact of government spending has actually been disequalizing for a variety of reasons. Yeah.
Prof, when you say, sorry, I'm just curious. So when you say disequalizing, you mean that
more unequal after
the way government spends its expenditure, it creates more inequality. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Now, this is something which so we have to really think very, very carefully about this. Now, the reason I argued earlier that we need a social protection system, but a social protection system cannot anticipate all situations. A social protection system could not have anticipated COVID-19. How many people in the world anticipated COVID-19 and its economic impacts? I think it's not fair to criticize the government or any government for not anticipating COVID-19. To be fair, almost all the US presidents, beginning from Clinton, Bush, and Obama, they all were thinking about a pandemic-type situation, but never the kind of scenario which we have been experiencing in the last over half a year. Now, what to his credit, although I don't like many of the things he does, Bill Gates did try to get this kind of thinking going, but unfortunately, it has been misinterpreted and so on and so forth. Now, what we really need to do is to recognize that you cannot anticipate every single possibility. And I mean, pretty much along the spirit of what Trisha was saying earlier, you can't get the government involved in everything, right? So you don't, and so that's why you need a social protection for so-called normal times.
Yes.
But you need to be able to provide for extraordinary times. And this is where what I call the social safety net. And I'm using it in a very particular way. Okay, a lot of people use social safety net almost interchangeably, and the term has become quite meaningless. So we need to recognize that this is a very unusual situation. But I think that we are not doing enough. We are not spending enough. The government is not spending enough in terms of trying to help people to get through this situation. And this is it's not very easy to do it in an emergency situation, and I would consider this to be an emergency. You are bound to make mistakes, but let not the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, if we try to say, oh, we must anticipate this and we must make sure there's no leakage here, no leakage there, you end up not doing anything. You know, so you need to be able to do certain things. And I think, you know, I mean, the last government, the PH government, should have kept its commitment to increase healthcare spending. It should have kept its commitment to do that. And if it had done so, there wouldn't have been this delay when it was a few weeks before the government could get up to the testing capacity target of 15 tests per week. You know, that made the situation unnecessarily, and then the lack of PPE, of personal protective equipment, that was an unnecessary, that should have been avoided. You know, the Malaysian Ministry of Health, one part of the Ministry of Health, responded as early as the 3rd of January, okay, saying that it had the capacity to respond. Okay, and yet nothing happened. Why? Okay, now the main reason was because the ministry did not have funds. You know, and if you remember, one of the last things the Tun Mahathir was trying to do was actually to get the bill through for supplementary spending to handle COVID-19. So I think what we need to recognize is that there are extraordinary measures there are extraordinary exigencies which force governments, and governments have to be able to respond to them. You cannot fully anticipate all situations, and that's why you need competence in government, competence in reviewing situations. Another thing which Tricia said, which was, I think, very, very important, is that you have an unnecessarily complex government.
Yes.
You have different agencies doing the different things. There's a lot of duplication and so on. One of the great things which was done in the earlier Mahathir administration was to introduce the MyCard. The MyCard should be the single identification card for all public purposes. So, for example, when you go and you want to when you are going to determine your tax liability, all you need to do is provide your MyCard, and if everybody is declaring their income, which is not the case currently, okay, all kinds of things are exempted. The government doesn't even want to know in many instances, and the result is that half the people who own luxury cars in this country don't even pay income tax. Can you imagine that? Half the people who own luxury cars, being defined as 2 liters and above, don't even pay income tax. So you have this kind of incongruous types of situation. So if you had all this information available, you could determine exactly who was in need, and you could disburse things. Now, of course, there will still be cheats. There will be cheats, but you cannot, because you are afraid of 0.5% cheats, one in 200 people, you don't do anything. That, you know, then the enemy the perfect becomes the enemy of the good.
Right. So that's why actually, like, for researchers like us, I mean, information actually really is key. And like I said earlier, you know, with the lack of information or people getting duplicate, you know, kinds of aid, subsidies, left, right, and center, there's no way to identify whether this X family is he getting more than what he should be getting, and money and aid that could otherwise have gone to another poor family? Is he getting less than what he should be getting, given the number of household members in the household, the number of children that they have? And I think this is where government can definitely play a role. I mean, we don't even talk about the need to have a Freedom of Information Act, which we actually do need. But can the government actually take the initiative to make their data available by default? So if they make data available by default, then put it out on the websites. I mean, there should be a centralization system to have the information tabulated so that we know for sure, okay, this person living in this part of the country, has access to this and aid, and then it can be fairly dispersed to others who are in need as well. I mean, as someone who does pay, her income, I do feel like, yeah, okay, why is somebody else who's earning the same amount as me not paying the same amount of tax? I mean, you're just talking about like comparing like with like here. So yeah, I think I really do believe that this access to information is really important. I mean, we have done forums at Ideas before where I have two different people from different ministries, and they actually say like they don't have access to the information because the other ministry is not able to provide it or doesn't want to provide it. So I think when we talk about government, we should also understand that it's not homogeneous, and there are also sort of turf wars within government itself. And sometimes we have had to provide that platform to even give different agencies an opportunity to talk to each other, which is very ironic, but that's just the reality as well.
Yeah, I think both of you have touched on a lot of points, in particular in relation to social protection. But we also see that the government announcing like they're going to reactivate the Malaysia Social Protection Council. We are a bit running out of time. We have another show coming up at 10 o'clock, but I just want to maybe just put to you both that what would you like to say that maybe you have not mentioned that maybe the council should really take into consideration in making policies that can either in short term safeguard Malaysians, or in long term maybe close the gap between inequality and all this. Trisha, do you want to go first?
Just on the point of inequality, I think if you look at kind of like a long-term trajectory, it does show that Malaysia's on a downward sloping curve, but only in the recent 1 year. I think we don't have the 2020 figures yet.
Not yet.
We have the 2019 figure, which shows that it's gone up a little bit compared to 2018. So we have to see what happens this year, like whether the trend is actually going up again. But prior to 2019, actually the curve is downward sloping. But I think this Social Protection Council that's being set up needs to actually, well, firstly, have a lot of information at its fingertips. So do research to know what social assistance is already being made available at which level of government and which ones are not. And then, number two, I think it has to be also updated given this year's pandemic. The problem is, of course, collection of data will take a little bit more time, and you may only be able to capture like T-1, basically the year before, rather than the active year. So the data is very important. And I think I do agree that actually there needs to be like some updating of some of the basic provisions. So like SOCSO, for instance, I think Prof mentioned at the very beginning that it's only limited to like certain health conditions. I mean, I wonder whether things like mental health should actually be included. So it's not just physical health, but can we accept that especially throughout the pandemic, I mean, like I'm sure mental health will be an increasingly important subject of discussion, and whether or not government institutions can adapt to talk about mental health in a way that these services can be provided. And finally, I think I've repeated myself a few times, but I really do hope to see the kind of aid that's being provided that can become more institutionalized. I mean, that's not really the answer to everything, because I know institutions themselves can fail us. the institutions are made up of people, and the people are the ones making decisions. But I would like to see a place where the welfare aid isn't so politicized, so we can stop talking about like, oh, oppositions don't get this and the government are the ones who get it. So like, let's just remove that layer so that there's no more finger pointing, but get the welfare aid to be distributed in a way that is rules based and that everyone benefits regardless of who you vote for.
Yeah, Prof, do you want to weigh in on this one? What recommendations do you have for the Social Protection Council?
I don't have any recommendations for the council. I don't know what the terms of reference are. I have no idea. There have been council after council after council, and I don't think SOCSO, for example, is created by any council. It really is a question of political will and the leadership of Tun Razak at that time in terms of going forward and thinking about the needs of the nation and creating the conditions for national unity. I do think, however, that there are some in the middle of a crisis. It's not easy. You can't try to reform everything in the middle of a crisis. So this is not the time for massive reforms. Li Ching, you asked a question earlier about whether there's fiscal space.
Yes.
And the matter is that precisely because we have not been taxing well and been taxing enough and fairly, we just don't have that fiscal space. So we need to recreate that fiscal space in the medium and long term. But for the time being, it means that we have to borrow. We have to borrow, and it basically means that there has to be far greater accountability and transparency to ensure that the money is well spent. And this is what is extremely important. So the kinds of information which Trisha is asking for and so on are extremely important, but there has to be a commitment to making this kind of information generally available, and right now I'm just afraid that we are going to go from a recession into depression if we do not take enough measures to revive the economy. The recession was unavoidable in many regards, but a depression is avoidable, but we need to be able to be bold. And right now, what we have is all these people in the financial market saying, "Oh, you cannot borrow because you reach this limit, and this arbitrary line is drawn, and we must not go across that limit." You do that, you kill the economy, and it's not everybody who's going to die. Of course, it's going to be the smaller business people, and very, very importantly, the people who are worst affected are the daily rated workers.
Yes.
Think about the crisis. The crisis is supposed to have helped. The measures are supposed to have helped the bottom 2/3, let us say. But the bottom third, many of them didn't get anything. The people who are running very small enterprises, the family enterprises, many of them didn't get very much, and they were prevented because of stay in shelter, lockdown. They were prevented from carrying on business as usual. Of course, demand has also collapsed. So you need to be able to revive demand, and particularly for local goods and so on and so forth. And this is why it's very important. So I'm very concerned, for example, that all those months when children were not going to school, those children who depend on the school feeding program, okay, for their main meal of the day, they were not getting that, and of course, if I wanted to be, I would want to revamp the school feeding program, because the school feeding program is on the basis of getting supplies from food companies, big food companies, foreign food companies, rather than from farmers, from farmer cooperatives, farmer associations, and so on and so forth. That's why, I mean, as much as I appreciate all these criticisms of the food security thing, I think that misses the mark if we do not see what are the major problems of the country. So we cannot reform everything at this time, but the most important thing is to overcome this popular psychological barrier of, we cannot borrow anything. We must revive the economy. That is essential, and we must begin from the bottom up. Begin with the daily rated workers. And one of the things which is already happening is that many foreign workers, Indonesians particularly, have already left the country.
Yes.
But let us face it, there are almost 7 million foreign workers in this country, 5 million of whom are not even documented. They have been driven underground. And if we look what happened in Singapore, the so-called second wave was mainly due to the fact that workers there, even though they were legal, were afraid. And here we are doing everything to frighten the workers. So which foreign worker who is infected is going to come forward? Nobody is going to come forward in these circumstances. So we have to stop this type of racism and other types of behavior and begin to think of the human interest, of the public interest, because together we can survive. But if we continue to remain divided and trying to find fault from the other, from with each other, and trying to make money from one another, I'm afraid we are going to sink together. That's what we're going to do together. So it is extremely important that we have the necessary fiscal means, as you put it, to have sufficient relief measures in order to revive the economy, and then we have much more selective industrial policy, if you will, to move the economy forward in terms of prioritizing areas of future development.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I think this is a good point to stop for our discussion tonight. Thank you so much, Prof. Jomo, and thank you, Tricia. Thank you for your time, and also thanks for all the audience that have been watching with us. Stay tuned. I mean, you can also, if you want to revisit the episode, you can watch it on our Facebook and also our YouTube channel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and nice to see you, Prof. Hope you're keeping well. Take care.
Yes. Don't forget your baby. Take care of your baby, okay?
Yes.
Don't think of calories alone. Huh?
Yes.
Okay, take care.
Bye, everyone.